Lucky to Be Here is a podcast that showcases the lives and experiences of those who took the leap and navigated big life and career transitions across countries. They share their stories, their lessons, and advice to show us what is possible and what it takes to define and live their idea of success across borders. Because we all need that extra nudge to make our next bold move and build our paths one day at a time. We're more than just lucky to be here. I am Dr. Analia Gomez Vidal, and I know a thing or two about big leaps and career pivots across countries. I am the founder of AGV Services LLC, a career development business that empowers bold career explorers, creating their paths across industries and countries without self doubt or overwhelm. To learn more about the work that I do and how we can support you through coaching and community, visit agvservicesllc.com. Welcome to Lucky to Be Here. I am really glad you are. Hi, everyone. I am very excited today to welcome Charlie Hunt. Charlie Hunt is an associate professor of political science at Boise State University. He's the author of 2 books about the U.S. Congress, the co-host of a Scandalized podcast on the NPR network, and he writes the Substacks newsletter, You Are Here, about the intersection of place, politics, and poetry. Welcome, Charlie.
I'm so happy to be here. You forgot the most important part of my resume, which is that I went to graduate school with you.
Exactly. We are both like grads from GVPT, Government and Politics at UMD. So proud Terps over here,
Yes.
connecting over nerding out about politics and poetry.
Yes. Who knew?
Exactly. Well, to get us started, I just read your bio, but let's start with the question that I love asking, which is, what is your story?
My instinct is to separate this into a version of my story that's about my work on the one hand, and then a version that's like my personal story on the other.
Mhm.
Uh, but I think in reality, the trajectory is kind of one and the same thing. So as kind of a young adult, I had a passion for writing. I grew up in Rhode Island, up in New England, and had a lot of different things I was passionate about, but as a young adult, sort of found writing as something I was really good at. I like to sort of think of this as the moment where kind of my creative energy sort of clicked on really for the first time. And that was a really significant moment, I think, both in my work and my personal life. It was something that because I was good at it, or at least was told I was really good at it, it made me want to do something big with it,
Mhm.
like something that was going to make a big impact and change the world, and lots of kind of idealistic creative energy happening with young high school Charlie. Um, and like when I got to college, I think there was a lot of grounding that happened, both in terms of my work and my personal life. I think there was a lot of confusion that sort of resulted from not quite knowing what I wanted to do.
Mhm.
Like at first, I wanted to be like the next great American novelist, and then realized that at least for me, that wasn't like an actual feasible career path. And so I sort of ended up discovering political science, of course, and that was a great experience. I love political science. I'm glad I do it for a living, but it's also something that I think introduced some healthy or maybe even unhealthy amount of cynicism into how I thought about myself, the world, my work. And so for I think a while, including, when I ended up in grad school, when I met
Mhm.
you in Maryland in my mid 20s, I was sort of in a more cynical space and still finding this thing I was getting really good at. And then by the time I left grad school, I think I had, you know, freed myself from a bunch of other constraints and really sort of found my voice as a political scientist and refound that creative energy that
Mhm.
I had sort of stumbled upon in high school as a way of thinking about my writing. But then in grad school, with my dissertation and all the stuff I was working on there, I was able to really find what what specifically I was passionate about
Mhm.
that I could then make into my life's work. And that was a really exciting moment because it sort of came along with this really, really big change in my life, which was getting this job at Boise State
Mhm.
University, which, if your listeners don't know, is in Idaho. Which, again, if your listeners don't know, is nowhere close to where I grew up, nowhere close to the East Coast. It was a place I had never been. It was this big unknown. And, moving out there, cutting a lot of ties, and kind of trying to establish a new life while I was also, a brand new professor trying to battle imposter syndrome and try to, establish myself in my career
Mhm.
was a huge change. But I think by that time, I was able to sort of get out of that cynicism, recapture some of that creative idealism, and take that energy to this new journey in a way that made it less daunting and more exciting. And so now, sort of 6 years into that, a lot of things have happened in my life. I met someone and I got married, and then I got tenure, and I've come out with a couple books, and just like there was a pandemic also, by the way. Like, all of these things happened within such a short period of time in the last 6 years that I think is kind of incredible looking back on it. But I think none of it would have been possible without sort of reclaiming that creative energy that I've now tried to take to a bunch of different projects I do in my work and obviously in my personal life.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. And, there are like multiple elements that resonate for me of what you're sharing. The first one, that top of mind, because, of our familiarity with grad school, I had my own journey kind of like identify, like with my own sense of identity around writing.
Hmm.
And I was coming from economics. I had done journalism. And one of the hardest moments during grad school was being in a meeting with my committee, where after me taking so much pride in my writing, hear them say, "Where writing is your weakest point right
Wow.
now."
Wow.
And I just started tearing up. And I didn't fully understand why. And it took me a long time afterwards to really connect the dots. But I think that there is also something to be said about who gets to be a writer, right? And
Yes.
so, and how we embrace that energy throughout everything that we do.
It's so, if I can follow up on that, like,
Yeah.
in thinking about that, like, I think part of the reason that resonates with me is that being a writer is so core to my identity. Like, it has, like, that's been the consistent through line.
Hmm.
That's what I've still been able to do. And so that really resonates a lot. And I don't know if it'll make you feel better to know that, like, I had a very similar experience in grad school when I went to defend my prospectus, which is
Hmm.
like the big proposal for your dissertation before you actually start writing the dissertation.
Hmm.
And, I sent it around to my committee and I was like, I'm feeling really good about this. Like, my advisor said it's really good. And I got some of the harshest feedback I have ever gotten on anything I've ever written. And just like with some saying, like, you need to start from square one. And I was like, I have built up this idea so much in my mind that now I have to rethink what it is. And I not only do I have to do the work of rewriting it and rethinking it,
Hmm.
but I have to do kind of the personal work of overcoming sort of the blow that dealt to my identity
Yeah.
and my sense of purpose. And I think that was kind of a real catalyzing moment where, like, I could imagine an alternate world where, like, that destroyed me and I ended up, like, abandoning grad school. And maybe that would have been, I'm sure I would have found something useful to do. But yeah, that I totally relate to that these sort of singular moments where
Hmm.
you have this challenge and then trying to turn it into something really, really special if you possibly can. And it's not always so easy.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other thing that also you mentioned that also connects with this podcast and the work that I do has to do with your experience of also starting your Idaho life, basically. And and kind of like doing those like big life and career transitions. And so I want to connect that with one of your projects, which is your newsletter, You're Here. And I remember reading the very first, like the announcement that you were starting this project and absolutely loving it. And so in that newsletter, you talk a lot about the importance of places and locations, both in politics and beyond that. And I wanted to ask you, where did your interest for places and understanding them come from?
That's a really good question. I think the reason this this newsletter, which, I mean, if there's such a thing in my life as a passion project, it's this, right? Like, it's
Mhm.
not, I don't make a living off of it. It is not something that is a big part of like my portfolio for work. This really is something I just kind of do for myself and the few people who kind of care about it. And I think the reason it's able to be that is because it is something that I recognized was really important in all different aspects of my life. My personal life, certainly. I mean, we all have different relationships with places and with home and what home means to us and things like that. It's a very personal thing because it's our lived environment. It's where we have all these meaningful experiences, whether it's, falling in love, falling out of love, reading something that inspires you, trying to defend your prospectus and getting totally shot down, right? The challenging moments too. And so that's where all of this happens. And it's impossible, I've found, to separate those moments from the places in which they happen. And that the place, the surroundings, the trappings of what is going on is absolutely essential to any story we tell. The books, the poetry, the podcast, all these creative things that I try to consume as much as possible of in my
Mhm.
life, they really do tend to have this through line of emphasizing the place and the what the impact of that place is on the story of whatever I'm reading. And that, I think, made it easier to help me recognize the impact of place on my own story in the way I just told it to you and the central role that it played. And then where I think the other piece of this came in was in my work. So, I study the US Congress. I mean, I
Mhm.
study a few other things too, but Congress tends to be the focus. And, rather than, I wasn't as interested in things like, legislative procedure or, things that happen in Capitol Hill or the impacts of policy, though all of those things are obviously really important.
Mhm.
Where I was interested in was these members' districts, like where they actually are coming from, where they are supposed to be representing, and what makes those different places really unique across America. And specifically the lived experience of those members' relationship to those places, whether they grew up there or whether they kind of parachuted in and decided to run for office. This is sort of like my central research question of my
Mhm.
career, which I still continue to really love. Like I know, Annie, like a lot of people do their dissertations and then never, like, turn their backs and never want to see it again in their lives. I'm the opposite. Like, I can't stop working on this stuff, which I
Mhm.
know it makes me really lucky. Speaking of lucky to be here, like, that's something that I really treasure. And I think it's because it was really motivated by this question of place. And so, plenty of things I've done wrong in my career, but if there's one thing I did right, I think it's connecting this thing I care about really personally,
Mhm.
which is the lived environment and impact of place, cities and neighborhoods and where we live, with, the sort of research purpose of my work, which I think has helped me stay motivated with it, in the general work that I do. But then with You Are Here, with the Substack that I do,
Mhm.
I'm able to, use portions of that, but also kind of step outside of the political, step outside of what I do kind of in my day job, and begin to integrate some of these other things like poetry, which, like, I can't emphasize this enough. I have no formal training in. I've never taken a poetry class. Like, you should not take my words about poetry to the bank. I just really love it. And
Yeah.
but it's something I really care about. And so finding a way to connect all of these is something that's really meant a lot to me. And this newsletter is kind of the place where I can do that and explore these ideas in a pretty low pressure environment. Like, it is
Mhm.
public, like anyone can read
Yeah.
it. And I hope that people do, but it's also, it's not the thing that gets the most attention in my work. And so it gives me a nice space to kind of play with a lot of these ideas, and anywhere I can kind of draw connections between what I do for a living and what's going on in my personal life, it's always through this lens of place. And so I'm happy to have this space to kind of explore that.
Yeah. And it's interesting, as you were sharing that, is like I can see the parallels. In my case, I still love my dissertation topic and all the research agenda, but instead I think I went into a little bit of a tangent, and instead I turned my life into an experiential learning project. So, like, the thing that I took from grad school to continue working on was less about the research and more about like the everything that goes around
Yeah.
into becoming either a PhD holder or like a professional down the line with a research background. But the thing that I find very interesting as a connecting point there too has to do with not just places, but one concept that for me has always been very present, either by being it or missing it, which is
Hmm.
home. So I'm curious to hear, what does home mean to you, and how has the concept changed over time?
Boy, what a big question, but a super important one. So, one word I think a lot about in relationship with home is familiarity.
Hmm.
So it's returning somewhere again and again, right? Waking up somewhere day after day, having, like we talked about, sort of formative, catalyzing experiences of your life in a place. So therefore, it's kind of familiar and maybe even comforting, right? This is something
Hmm.
that comes with familiarity. But I've also, especially as I've sort of gone on and lived in different places, I've learned that that doesn't mean that you love everything about your home, right? Far from it. Sometimes, I mean, I'm sure we can both think of thing. You and I grew up in very different places. I'm sure we can both
Yes.
think of things we do love and things we do not love about the
Hmm.
places where we grew up. And so I think the familiarity, though, is one element that is tough to replicate. Like, you can't replicate it without having actual lived experience somewhere in a home. And it has to be like, home has to be a place that you call it, right? You can't force a home onto someone if they don't think
Hmm.
about it in that way. And that's one thing I think makes it really special as a concept. And I think a related word I think about a lot with home is commonality. That not only is a place that you would call home familiar, but it's also probably familiar to others, right?
Hmm.
It's something you, and then that's something you have in common with them. So, home is a way of kind of binding us together in a lot of ways, which to me
Hmm.
is really important in a time where there's so much polarization, political disagreement. Obviously, that's something I think about a lot,
Hmm.
and animosity between people, in a lot of cases based on some sort of lack of shared destiny or space. That if we can't identify that thing that we have in common, then it's really hard to solve whatever problems we have, whether they're interpersonal or policy based or whatever
Hmm.
else. And I think this shared space kind of forces different types of people to live together in ways that I think can be really beneficial. Like, we kind of have to do this, right? Because we know what the
Hmm.
alternative is. We see it every day on really grand scales like this,
Hmm.
that if we have shared space but we have very different ideas of what it is or what home is there, and we can't agree upon that together, then people will go to really catastrophic lengths to resolve it, even when that means like violating the humanity of your
Hmm.
neighbors. And so that's something I think about a lot, both in my research and I think in, as I'm reading the news and in my daily life and things like that. And in thinking about how it's changed, to me, the biggest element of home that's changed is who I experience it with. And so this gets to that
Hmm.
commonality thing, right? Like, every new place I move, like, I've lived in it, like, my key places in my life have been, the Providence, Rhode Island area, which is where I
Hmm.
grew up and where I went to college. It's Washington D.C., which is where we went to grad school, and
Hmm.
where I lived for, on and off for 5 years. And then it's Boise, Idaho, where I live now. And obviously all of these places have very different, very unique cultures, grocery stores and parks and sports teams and all those things. And I find my own ways of relating to or caring about those things. But the biggest change is always like, who am I living with? Right? Who am I sharing these spaces with? Like, who are the people where going forward, whenever I look back and think about this place or feel nostalgic, I am automatically thinking of those people. And so, I think about a place like College Park, Maryland, or Washington, D.C., is exactly like that for me, right? Where,
Mhm.
and maybe it was for you too, where I can't think about time spent in Tidings Hall or McKeldin Library or wherever we would have classes or like just goof around when we were supposed to be working.
Yeah.
It's impossible for me to really feel what it was like in those places without thinking about, for example, like our cohort of students,
Mhm.
right? Or about you, right? And
Mm.
like I really do mean that and that's a happy example, but it's not always happy
Mhm.
or uncomplicated, right? Having a place be tied to somebody. Sometimes we live with somebody for a while, we internalize a place as somewhere where we feel at home with them, but then sometimes it doesn't work out, right? Or a relationship ends or falls apart, and it can complicate the way we think about the place. But I
Mhm.
also don't think that's a bad thing. It just is what it is, right? It's something. I think what's changed about home is I've learned to be at peace with that in one way or the other. That the times we spend in these different places are just exactly what they are, and they're part of living in and experiencing a place is sort of taking the good, the bad, the neutral, and mundane sort of all together at once.
I couldn't help but remember, like the Friday mornings American politics workshops with the bagels.
The
As you
bagels.
were.
Yep. Sitting around that,
Uh,
and you see the faces around that table. It's not just you and the bagels,
yes,
right?
exactly. But yeah, no, I think it's a shared sentiment, and the word that comes to mind for me, which is also one that I always that I say so much that people are going to get tired of hearing me saying it, but I truly believe it, is that I would connect commonality with community, right? What you were saying just now of like that sense of community of the people that are there, for
Hmm.
better or for worse, right? Like the description of a time and a place is also inherently linked to who were you with during that
Yeah.
time, and who do you get to connect or reconnect and go back to that place, right? And I think that that works, at the local scale, but also in bigger scale, right? Like our conversation is just making me think about the different countries that I've been in, and how much of that sense of commonality and familiarity and home I have felt in each of them, and there is inevitably so much of it is tied to the people who made it feel homier during each
Yeah.
of those times.
Yeah. I totally agree. And, thinking back to like all these different versions of myself that have been in these different places, like the people I have known in those places are really different, and therefore I am also different at these different at these other times and places because these places make us, in a lot of ways, who we are. Obviously, there are things that run. I have loved writing and reading in all of the places that I've lived. Like that's one commonality that runs through everything, but a lot of things have changed, and it's just sort of being okay with that. That is really hard to do, but that I've tried to learn and studiously teach myself if I can.
Yeah, and to kind of like circle it back to what we were talking about earlier, something that I have been reflecting a lot on is this concept of home, but not just externally, but also home within, right?
Hmm.
And so then connecting the dots to what we were talking about earlier of finding spaces where we can play, right? We can find
Yeah.
our playgrounds to connect who we are in its entirety, and not just like the version of me that goes into research mode or the version of me
Hmm.
who goes into writing mode. And so piecing that together is a collective like process.
Yeah, I do think it's something we do together. I mean, it's interesting because, I was talking about the newsletter and like, yeah, for the most part, it's something I do on my own. I'm writing by myself, but I've also found that a lot of the really meaningful sort of outputs and outcomes from it have been when like someone's left a comment that has said, oh, I was just thinking the exact same thing, but I didn't really know how to say it. And this poem that you shared really resonated, and that means a lot to me. And so, building these small communities, I think, where we can, especially, in this age that where, you and I have grown up around the same time,
Hmm.
where what it means to be with people and communicate with people, especially during and after the pandemic,
Hmm.
I think has changed a lot. And I think and it's not all bad. Like I like we are able to do this
Hmm.
recording,
Yeah.
even though we are in very different places, which is really wonderful and a total gift. But it also means that we need to think critically and mindfully, I think, about what it means to be together. How do we not let getting together in person and being with each other totally get away from us,
Hmm.
because it is incredibly important um, to the process of building a place and understanding where we are in it, because otherwise we're just at our desks in any
Hmm.
office and it's all the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important for us to think about, and the sort of technological improvements again that are really amazing sort of put the onus on us
Hmm.
to think actively about it and make it a purpose of ours to sort of get
Hmm.
together with people in person and have these experiences in ways that we didn't have to, even 20 years ago
Yeah.
or 25 years ago, like when you and I were growing up as young people.
In that generation that got to witness and experience every single technological change.
Yeah, a real blessing and a curse.
So, speaking of that process, what have you felt? What has been one of the most like challenging aspects of following your path, like life and career wise, while also thinking about the importance of place and community as part of it?
Let's see. I mean, one really challenging aspect that I've adjusted a lot to over the last 6 years since I've lived in Boise and since I've started doing a lot more of these kind of public facing
Hmm.
work projects and experiences and things like this. That's not something I was ever used to. I was not like a big performer growing up or anything like that. And so I think that's been a big challenge, but it's been a fun challenge of trying to like balance, on the one hand, getting in touch with that creative energy that I talked
Hmm.
about earlier, channeling it into a way, into sort of a format that works and that actually says something meaningful. um, and then on the other hand, finding a way to translate that and put it into words that actually mean something to people and that are not just that aren't just sort of going out into the void. Coming up as an academic, we're told to publish all the time in
Hmm.
peer reviewed journals that I say this with love to peer reviewed journals that nobody reads, like very few people read. And I'm not trying to I'm not trying to make your listeners cynical, but we should say that only a few people who really care about
Hmm.
the subject read, which can be a really beautiful thing. But I found, a couple years sort of legitimately into my career here at Boise State as an instructor and as a researcher, that I wanted something more. I wanted a little something extra.
Hmm.
I had this I sort of saw this mismatch that I was not the first person to notice. Like, we know that there is this issue with research being too complicated for people to understand, written in a way that doesn't resonate with people, that is not put in sort of layman's
Mm-hmm.
terms, and that there is this gap that needs to be bridged between the really important research that hard sciences and social sciences and political, like all these in between, really do every
Mm-hmm.
day and needs to continue being done, and then what the output is on the public side and what the public can benefit
Mm-hmm.
from the things that we do and the things that we research. Because one thing I have learned is that the research that I do, it needs to mean a lot to me, but that can't be all that it is, right? It
Mm-hmm.
can't just be some, for me, it can't just be some fun thing that I do. It needs to be something that can at least make some impact and help people contextualize the stuff they're seeing out in the world, especially in something like politics, which is such a kind of third rail thing that's really hard to talk about, for families to talk
Yes.
about, for people don't want to talk about. And I sort of decided that I wanted to really try to jump this gap,
Mm-hmm.
jump this hurdle, and try a few things that might work. You know, I've tried it with podcasts and the newsletter and these other things, and writing for more public facing outlets. And I've been lucky enough to work at a place that really values that. But has not always been so easy. I have made big mistakes. I have said things the wrong way sometimes, and learned over time how to communicate in, I think, more effective ways. So that's been, I think, both a really big challenge for
Mm-hmm.
me, but one that, you know, in living in a comfortable space and working at a workplace that seems to really value me, which I think is another, like, an aspect of place that we don't always think about, but I think is
Mm-hmm.
really, really important, that has given me the flexibility to make mistakes and do stuff like that and get better in
Mm-hmm.
my kind of public communication. So that's one. It's a challenge, but thankfully it's one that I feel like I'm in the process of turning
Mm-hmm.
into a benefit.
And, thinking about someone who's listening, right, and seeing your trajectory so far, you mentioned, the place where you work is, and you feel valued is an important part of it that helps you navigate it. What is something else that also supports you in that process of the learning by doing that you find yourself in?
I think I mean, this is, this is going to sound incredibly cheesy, but it's the first thing that came to mind. So we're recording this, actually on my 3-year anniversary with my wife. She's just in the other room. Maybe she's listening through the door.
Congratulations.
Thank you. um, Having a partner who, not just, and this doesn't have to be a romantic partner. This can be a
Hmm.
friend, a mentor, right? And I have those as well. I had those at University of Maryland that were absolutely essential, and friends like you and other people in our cohort. And the thing these folks all have in common is that it was not just sort of being there as a support, as a, here, I'll catch you if you fall. You know, I'll mix you a drink if you've had a hard day or whatever else. Um, it's, especially in the case of my partner, it's been actively pushing me to find myself and find my own voice.
Hmm.
That, you know, loving me for that sort of creative spark that I first found in high school when I learned how to
Hmm.
write, and that has sort of carried through the whole time. You know, there need to be some limits on that. Like, one thing I wanted to make sure with this newsletter, I wasn't just like, you know, spilling my guts all over the page and like publishing my journal. Like, I don't know if you ever had like a live journal. It wouldn't be like that,
Yes.
but but making sure, like, having someone who knows you well enough to make
Hmm.
sure that you don't lose touch with that really essential, authentic part of yourself, which is so easy to lose, especially, you know, if you're online a lot and you're seeing a
Hmm.
lot of opinions coming your way. It can be really hard to sort of form your own feelings, come up with your own ways of expressing what you think about what's going on, especially again in something like politics. um, and so I think for me the big support has been not just having a partner and mentors who are there to help me if something's wrong, though that's
Hmm.
really important too, but sort of knowing me well enough to know, you know, to ask the pertinent question of like, is this, is this really what you want to do, or are
Hmm.
you just saying you want to do this to please someone else?
Yeah.
um, or is there this other thing that maybe requires you being vulnerable or taking a chance, and putting yourself out there? And maybe that's a voice you should pay attention to. And sometimes you need that outside person to make
Hmm.
that suggestion. I don't think I would have started the newsletter without her, and
Yeah.
without others telling me there was something there
Hmm.
that I should try to sort of listen to. So I think that's, if my advice, to the extent that my advice is useful in any way, would be to, if you find someone in your life who is like that, hang on to them as tightly
Hmm.
as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, this is also tied to a lot of the conversation that we hear when it comes to our career development and professional spaces. And, it is true that there are legitimate circumstances in which it might not be safe or it might not feel safe to
Of course.
be fully yourself. But to the
Yes.
extent that you have spaces where you can, honoring
Yes.
that always pays off. And it's the action that leads to the confidence that keeps nurturing you as you go along. And then, we all benefit from that. Like, I benefit every time that I see in my inbox, you're here, and it's like, okay, it's time for my morning coffee. And rather than reading the newsletter, let's see what I learned today. And so, like, you share about what has helped you along the way, and you also mentioned, there were a lot of lessons along the way. Basically, based on all of this, what is one thing that you have done that you advise others not to do now?
Ooh, what a good question. I was gonna say something like, don't get cynical. But that's a really hard thing to ask, I feel like,
Hmm.
especially in, frankly, in the current environment where there's a lot of really confusing and, in some cases, like distressing and catastrophic things
Hmm.
going on in the world. And so it's hard to, with a straight face, look at people and say it's going to be fine. Like, don't get cynical. Like,
Hmm.
plus, I talked earlier about my story of sort of, refinding my creative
Hmm.
spark and using that, and I'm really grateful for that. But I'm also really grateful for the sort of period of time in my 20s where I was a little skeptical. I was a little
Hmm.
cynical. It really helped me. Like, even though I'm glad I'm not totally in that mindset anymore, it did help hone the sort of scientist part of my mind of
Hmm.
like looking at problems and being realistic about them. Because, like, I still see myself as a very analytical person, and that's a helpful thing to counterbalance some of the like bleeding heart kind of creative side of me that, if left unchecked, could get me into huge trouble. In terms of what not to do, maybe it's just not necessarily following every whim, but learning to sort of trust yourself.
Hmm.
I think the times in my life where I have felt most stuck, or like I can't move forward, are times when I have not uh, trusted my instincts
Hmm.
and trusted my own sort of internal compass of who I am and what it is I actually want. It can be really hard to separate out what it is I actually want in my heart and my mind versus what other people want, what someone I love wants, but that maybe isn't
Hmm.
so good for me. This can be incredibly confusing. And so it's not that you should like always trust your instincts and just go and do whatever whim you think of. It's more just like, don't lose touch with that voice if you possibly can, because the times in my life when I've been the most stuck are when I have lost touch with that voice and or like actively tamped it down in
Hmm.
the interest of not rocking the boat or not creating conflict or not, or not being vulnerable, God
Hmm.
forbid, right? And so, I would say that's something that it's a time I'm grateful for, but yeah, but I suppose I would say it's a time where maybe I wasn't totally listening to myself.
Thank you for sharing that. And so now for anyone who's listening who, like looks at your current, work and your portfolio of creative projects, because I do believe that everything that we create is creative in nature.
Yes.
um, what is one piece of practical advice that you would give them as they aspire to, follow that path in some way?
One thing that's really helped me, this is a piece of advice I got from my faculty advisor at University of Maryland, Christina Miller, who's one of my favorite people. And I mean, her advice was very specific to my dissertation, which
Mhm.
is not applicable to everybody. Not everybody should write or try to write a dissertation. I can't say I like recommend it actively.
Mhm.
Um, but what she always said was like we would sit in her office and talk through some theoretical issue, or like, how am I going to measure this, or which of these two paths do I want to follow in this chapter, what makes the most sense to like build the story of the district. And so where we would usually end is in this ambiguous place. And the advice she would always give me, which was always worth following, was, we've talked about this for a couple hours now. This was basically her way of saying, like,
Mhm.
I have other things to do, get out of my office. But she, go home, like, first of all, like, take a break from thinking about this, then go back to a completely blank sheet of paper and write down or type out, or however you do it, what try to approach it from a sort of beginner's mind, of like as if you're approaching this problem for the first time.
Mhm.
And that is maybe where some of these authentic feelings are going to come through, because then you're going to have the version of this idea that is probably really messy. Like when you go to
Mhm.
rewrite those couple of paragraphs or whatever it is, it's going to come out messy. It's not going to come out perfectly formed, but it is going to come out authentically.
Mhm.
And then that's like a starting point where you can take it. And that would always serve me well when writing my dissertation. And it served me well when thinking about, whether it's the You Are Here newsletter, or whether it's something like the Scandalized podcast that I,
Mhm.
I do with my friend and my colleague Jackie Kettler, where we sort of analyze through the political science lens political scandals throughout American history. And we talked about a bunch of different ways of doing it. And then we sort of take a step back and say, like, well, what's the core of this? Well, it's like when you and I are like having beers at happy hour and are like, oh my God, can you believe this politician did this? And like following that energy wherever it goes. And
Mhm.
then other things will fall into place after that. But I think going back to that blank sheet of paper, literally or metaphorically, can really help sometimes. And it's hard because sometimes that means like deleting paragraphs of work that you've done and just throwing it out the window. And I know you can relate to this. And that's
Mhm.
so scary. It feels
Yeah.
so wasteful. But like sometimes it's really essential to get back to the actual core of what you were trying to
Mhm.
say or trying to express in the first place.
Yeah, and what's interesting is like in our brains, it's always like, oh, I need to start over, right? And it's
Yeah.
no, whether it's writing on that page or even like thinking about changing careers, like there is always a, oh no, now I have to start over, or I have to start from scratch. And the reality is that is never 100% true,
Yes.
because everything that you have done, even if you start on a blank page, is
Yeah.
always going to be informed in some way by everything that you have already done.
That's so true. That's also is an essential way I think about place, to go back to our, like,
Hmm.
where I live now and how I think about where I live now is absolutely informed by what my life was like in DC, what my life was
Hmm.
like on the East Coast in Providence. And we're all products of all of the things that have, all of the events, all of the places, all of the people that have brought us to where we are today.
Hmm.
And it's okay to leave some things behind, but I think it's also important to like recognize that we are a product of all these things. And I think that's great. I think it's beautiful.
Hmm.
Like it really does kind of mean we're all unique in a lot of ways. And so I find that sort of hopeful.
Yeah. Well, so before we wrap up, I have one question. If you were to meet the version of you that was just starting, that had that had just moved to the DC area. We were
Mhm.
about to start our journey in graduate school and beyond. Um, what would you like them to know?
Oh boy, what I would tell that young man. I think I would say that none of this none of this is permanent, but all of this matters. And I think those are things that can both be true. Um, on the one hand, there's sort of this Buddhist idea of impermanence, right? That
Mm-hmm.
that everything passes away and things live and things die, and it's all, if there's one thing that we can trust about life, about the places we live, even if we stay rooted in one place for a long time, that place changes and we change,
Mm-hmm.
right? So even if we're not moving, things change. And I think that's really important to recognize. Like I'm kind of a sucker for nostalgia. I'm a nostalgic person.
Same.
um yeah, like I can't, like it's hard for me, like one thing I love about, there are a lot of things I hate about my iPhone, which is like trapping me in some kind of prison all the time, but I do love being able to like see those old photos that pop up, these
Mm-hmm.
featured photos, and sometimes there are some from like our time in DC, and it makes me either really happy or really sad or really, lucky to be alive. But nostalgia can also be kind of a trap sometimes. It can keep us, like it has definitely kept me from being fully present in the place where I actually do live currently. And so that's something that I think impermanence and recognizing the reality of impermanence helps us sort of combat against a little bit. On the other hand, I do think like it's okay to be human and recognize that we miss places, that we miss
Mm-hmm.
them, usually for good reasons. And that like it's okay to sort of long for different times, especially if things are really hard currently.
Mm-hmm.
I think that can be a valuable sort of solace. So I think both of those things can be true at once, but I think that is a lesson that, I have no regrets about, how the last 10, 15 years of my life have gone. Not really. But that is probably something I would tell um, that fellow in his mid 20s starting this new big chapter, which is that you're feeling a lot of things right now. There's a lot of change. One day you're going to miss all this, just like, you miss your college
Mm-hmm.
days or whatever. But at the same time, it's okay to let things go and let things pass by in certain ways, because it's going to happen eventually. And so you might as well learn to be okay with that and maybe
Mm-hmm.
even find some beauty in it.
Thank you so much, Charlie. So, before we wrap up, where can people find you?
People can find me a few different places. You can find me on LinkedIn, on Instagram at Charlie Hunt. I don't post too often in either of those places, but you can see some of my work there. Based on most of what we talked about today in terms of the newsletter, if people are interested in that, they can go to youarehere.substack.com. They can find me there. Or you can search for Scandalized on NPR if you're interested in some like hot gossip, juicy gossip about political scandals. But yeah, that's where you can find me.
Thank you so much for your time today. Always a pleasure chatting together. And I am certain that this will not be the end of the conversation. So, looking forward to more of it.
I can't wait. I can't wait already. Thanks so much for having me.
If you made it to the end of this episode, thank you. Remember that you can use code LUCKY25, LUCKY25, to get 20% off when you subscribe to my coaching membership, AGB Lab for Career Explorers. Learn more about AGB Lab and book your call to join using the link in the show notes. That is all for today. My name is Dr. Analia Gomez Vidal, and I thank you for joining us today on Lucky to Be Here. If you liked this episode, please make sure to rate and review and subscribe wherever you're listening. You can also sign up to our newsletter using the link on our show notes to access the video version of our episodes. To learn more about the work that I do to support bold career explorers across countries through coaching and community, please visit agvservicesllc.com and follow AGV Services LLC on LinkedIn and Instagram. I'll see you next time.